Welcome to the Trinities podcast, where we explore theories about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Episode 36, Part 2 of my interview with Dr. Bart Ehrman. In this episode, we continue the conversation, focusing on the Gospel of John and the topic of monotheism. Dr. Ehrman, welcome to the Trinities podcast.
Thanks for having me again.
One thing I like about your book is that you distinguish three things. First of all, there's being called God, right? Having words like theos and deus applied to you or being addressed as God. That's one thing. Another thing is being divine in some very rough and loose sense, being kind of a God, being a mighty being. So you might be an angel, a divinized human, or a lower down deity. We could call that a generic concept of divinity. And some people have harped on this a little bit. He's so vague in his talk of divinity, but actually I think the generic concept of divinity is vague. That's why it's so widely used and so important to, I think, all religions that exist. And then you distinguish those two. So being called a God, being a God, you distinguish those from being numerically identical to the one God. We call that the monotheistic concept of divinity, the kind of concept of God that you see in Isaiah and Deuteronomy. This God is also a generic God, but is also a lot more, right? He's uniquely provident, all-powerful, all-knowing, and so on. Now, as you point out, and as Jesus points out in John chapter 10, we shouldn't infer too much from someone being addressed as God or referred to as God, because in the Old Testament, the word God is applied to angels and even to certain men. So now, about the Gospels, in your view, the authors of the Synoptics think that only the generic concept of divinity applies to Jesus, right? And that only after his resurrection and exaltation?
Yes, that's right. Only I understand it like that, but with a slight shift. I don't think that the Synoptics, the authors of the Synoptics themselves, I don't think that they think that Jesus became God only at his resurrection. I think that Mark thinks that Jesus became the Son of God at his baptism, and at that point he is a divine being. He's God, but he's not God the Father. This might be what you mean by a generic understanding of God. And I think Luke thinks that Jesus became the Son of God when he was conceived by the Holy Spirit. So that it's not at the resurrection for them. But that Jesus is God, but he's not God the Father. He's some other level of divinity.
So despite their varying views about when maybe he attained this status, your point is that he is a divinity in a lesser sense. I mean, yes. Here's a friendly point to you. I think it's part of monotheistic culture to, in most cases, reserve the word God for the monotheistic God.
Yes.
So say the other ones aren't really gods, even if you are thinking of them as mighty beings.
Yes.
You might call them gods once in a while, but you're pretty much going to reserve God talk for the one God.
Yes.
I mean, this is consistent with your thesis because this would explain why they very rarely call him God, even if they think that he's a divine being.
Yes.
Okay, then now what I'm a little bit confused about is quite how the Gospel of John is different from those. And up front, I'll tell you, my concern is I wonder if you're being a little bit uncharitable to the Gospel of John, if you're interpreting him, the author, as inconsistent. But, I mean, just as background, you do think the Gospel of John, or the first, all but the last chapter, you do consider that as a unit, right? Not including the woman caught in adultery. Do you look at it as a whole book?
Yeah. No, I mean, it was made up of earlier sources, which create certain kinds of tensions within the Gospel of John. But there was somebody who took these sources and compiled them into what we think of as the Gospel of John, yeah.
Right. Okay, so you look at it as a unified voice, as it were. So then you want to, if possible, attribute a single view to it and not an inconsistent view, right?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. I think there are absolutely inconsistencies in it. And it's because the authors used a variety of sources in compiling his narrative. So I would not say that it's completely consistent with itself.
Interesting. So
again, that's not a novel view. I mean, that's pretty much the standard view among scholars of the Gospel of John, that it used sources. These sources sometimes are at odds with one another, and sometimes there are literary tensions because of that.
Sure. But specifically about Jesus and God, I mean, do you view it as self-consistent on that, on how Jesus and God relate to one another?
I think there are different Christologies and different sources behind the fourth gospel.
Right. But
So-
then doesn't the author then present a coherent view of his own?
Well, pretty much. But I mean, just to give you an example, the way the Gospel of John begins is with this fantastic prologue. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. Glory as of the only Son before the Father. So this is a fantastic song of praise to the Word of God that became a human being. And that human being then was Jesus. That prologue almost certainly came from a different source from the rest of the Gospel. And one piece of evidence that's traditionally used to show that is that in the rest of the Gospel, the term, the Word, never appears. So why not, if this is the key term for understanding the Gospel of John? It's because the prologue comes from a different source and has a slightly different understanding of Christology from the rest of the Gospel. So whoever put the Gospel together, probably, I think he imagined that he was presenting a unified whole. But you can find slight inconsistencies in its portrayal of Christ and of lots of other things.
Okay. So let me explain more what I'm a little perplexed about, having read the book carefully. You say that in the Gospel of John, the author makes Jesus and God equal, and I'm pretty sure that you mean qualitatively equal and not numerically equal, because you say a little bit later, you say, I need to be clear, Jesus is not God the Father in this Gospel. But of course, the Gospel identifies the Father as the one true God in chapter 17. So if Jesus is not the Father, then Jesus is not numerically the same as the one true God, right?
He's not the same. So what I say in the book is that he's not identical with God. He's equal with God.
Right, in the sense of qualitative equality, like similarity, right? Not being the same being.
Yeah, he is not the same as God the Father. So when Jesus prays in chapter 17, he's not talking to himself.
Right. He doesn't bear the relation to God that you bear to Professor Ehrman, right?
No, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So then what you're saying is that this author is making Jesus divine in a high sense, but not in a sense that implies that he just is the one God himself.
That's right.
Okay. But, I mean, on the monotheistic conception of a God, if there was another being that had full divinity in that same sense, it would, by definition, be another monotheistic God. But the presupposition of monotheism is that it's impossible for there to be one more God in that sense, right? Because a God is a unique...
Not in all monotheistic systems. That's the philosophical position that got worked out by the fourth Christian century. But by the first century, monotheists didn't think that way. I mean, philosophically, you could argue that it's impossible for two beings to be almighty. And theologians started arguing that at the end of the second century and then into the third and fourth. And that became kind of a dogma by the fourth century. But
I just have in mind the rhetoric like you find in Isaiah, right? There's no one like me,
yes,
only
right.
I.
Yeah.
He's claiming to be uniquely provident and to be the only creator, basically.
Yeah, right.
But then there couldn't be two of those. There couldn't be two uniquely provident
Well, that's what you and I think because of our philosophical traditions. But the early Christians, this is what created precisely what you're pointing to is what created the problem that led to the decision to have a Trinity. The idea of the Trinity is that Father, Son, and Spirit are all equally God, and one is not superior to the other. They're all the same, equally God, but there's only one God. So it's monotheism, and yet there are three distinct persons who are God. So this is, it's an important point for the Trinitarian controversies of the fourth century and following, that it's not that the Father is more powerful than the Son. They are equally powerful.
Right, but you only see that in the fourth century.
Yeah, that's
you don't
my
see
point.
it in
that's my
yeah,
point.
you don't see it in John, and you don't see it in the second century.
Exactly. Yeah,
heavyweights.
that's my point.
So my point about John is, though, right? He thinks there's only. Let me stick with uncontroversial stuff. John thinks there's only one God, right? Because he's a Jew. But then
no, he thinks there are many gods.
Let me clarify. He thinks there's only one monotheistic God, even while there might be many generic deities, right?
Well, he thinks the Word was God as well as God.
I thought you interpreted the word in John 1 as basically a divine attribute that gets expressed in Jesus.
No, the word, it's a hypostasis that ends up becoming a human. But in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, so that means it's a separate being from God because it's with God. And yet the Word was God. So the Word is both God and with God at the same time.
So if I understand you, you're saying that you don't think that John has the concept of a monotheistic deity where it's just an obvious implication that there couldn't be two of them? Is that right?
today, when we talk about monotheism, we think that means there's only one supreme God. In the ancient world, monotheism meant that there's one God who's over all, but there are other gods who serve below him.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
But
and that's
so,
what John understands Jesus to be.
To be one of those lesser gods.
Yeah.
But then that's what the synoptics are saying. It's just not in eternity.
Oh, well,
but they're giving that same status to him.
In the Gospel of John, Christ pre-exists his coming into the world. He was the one who created the universe, and you don't find anything like that in the synoptics. In the synoptics, Jesus becomes the Son of God at some point of his existence. But in John, Christ pre-existed and was the one who created the universe.
So is the only difference then just the time or a slight difference in degree in divinity?
No, it's not a slight difference at all. It's an enormous difference. I mean, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is a man. When he gets baptized, God adopts him to be his son. In the Gospel of John, Christ existed in eternity past and created the universe. That's a huge difference.
But it's a difference within, in your view, the realm of lesser deity.
In both he's a lesser deity, yes.
All right, now I understand your view a little better. Very often, evangelical or Catholic authors are very happy to interpret John as self-contradictory because they're happy with paradoxes,
yes.
right?
Yes.
A paradox means an apparent contradiction.
Yes.
The problem with that is when we're interpreting any other thing, we try really hard to avoid those on the assumption that the author is not confused.
Yes.
And if we can't help it, then we'll attribute one as a last resort, but we try hard. So I thought you were doing that, especially in the part toward the end where you're talking about the orthoparadoxes. But then, I mean, as you explain, and I think this is correct, and other scholars have said this as well, there's just nothing inconsistent at all with believing in one monotheistic deity and many other deities that are, in some sense, great beings.
What I call orthoparadoxes, I think, are later than the Gospel of John, because the reason it ended up becoming a problem for Christians is because they wanted to insist that there's only one God, and that Jesus is God, and that God the Father is God. And they wanted to insist on all of those points. And it created the paradox that you're referring to, because logically it doesn't work. And so you just have to say that it's a mystery of faith.
Well, here's what's interesting. I mean, this paradox was not perceived early on in the second century. If you look at Origen or Tertullian, for instance, when their monotheism is in question, and you look really closely at how they argue, they're not arguing that there's only one Trinity, or even arguing that there's one divine nature and somehow that amounts to monotheism. What they do is they emphasize the uniqueness of the Father, and then they speculate also about how Jesus has a kind of divinity that's derived from his.
Yeah, no, that's right. They hold to a subordinationist Christology, where the Son is subordinate to the Father, and that was a very popular. That was the dominant view until the Arian controversy in the 4th century. Arian gave it explicit expression, and it got beat down by the ones who wanted to insist, no, that the Son is actually equal with the Father. He's not subordinate to the Father.
I wonder if you exaggerate the difference between John and the Synoptics. I mean, there's a constant drumbeat in John emphasizing the subordination of Jesus to the Father, right? And in that day, in the 1st century or round about the end of the 1st century, they didn't have a two natures theory where they could say the one nature was fully great and all-knowing and so on and all-powerful, and the human nature wasn't. Nor was there the spin that Jesus is only functionally subordinate to God, but not ontologically subordinate. John, this author emphasizes that Jesus only does the Father's will. It's the Father that does the works through him. He's totally a servant of God, and God testifies to him and so on. I was actually kind of surprised by some of your arguments about John. For instance, you citing I and the Father are one in John 10:30. And, I mean, the immediate context there seems to be just that they're one in purpose or in action. In other words, they're about the same business.
Yeah, well, John, as I was saying, John's a complicated gospel because it's based on, there are a lot of different sources underlying it. And there are statements in John that are not just that, Jesus is the one who fulfills God's purposes. I mean, Jesus claims to be God in this gospel, which is why the Jews constantly are taking up stones in order to stone him to death. When Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, he appears to be taking the name of God, because God gave it to Moses in Exodus 3. when Moses asked, "What is your name?" and God replied, "I am." That's his name, and Jesus claims that name for himself. They pick up stones to stone for committing blasphemy because he's making himself out to be God.
Right. This is one of the things I wanted to ask you about. You're arguing in this way, which is a very traditional way, but there's a minority report within Christianity which doesn't take it that way. So, when they say he's making himself equal to God in John 10, he basically points out that beings other than God, even men, can be called gods. And then he forcefully clarifies that he's only calling himself the Son of God. And then you get to the end of the book, and he says he has to ascend to his God and to our God. And the author,
I don't think
the original ending.
I don't think John's worked it out philosophically very clearly, but, Jesus also says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I mean, and when the Word becomes flesh, that's God that becomes a human being. I think that is radically different from the Synoptics. The Synoptics don't have an incarnation Christology where a divine being becomes human and that person is Jesus.
Yeah, that sounds paradoxical to me. I mean, about the I am, before Abraham was I am, as you know, ego eimi in Greek is idiomatic for I am he or I am the one. So earlier in that chapter, he says, unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. And you're supposed to infer, that he's the Son of God or that he's the Messiah.
Yeah, no, I think you have to look at obviously ego eimi just means I am. And what you have to do is look at the context of any particular expression. And
right.
John's pretty clear that when he says, before Abraham was, I am, for one thing, he's claiming to have existed before the father of the Jews, Abraham. And for another,
well, that's how the Jews take him, right? But he says Abraham saw my day, right? As a prophet foresees the future.
Yeah, I know, but he existed before Abraham.
Well, before Abraham was, I am he, right? So you could take that as basically a predestination statement. There's parallels for this in other places in the New Testament.
Why did they pick up stones to stone him?
Well, see, this is one of the things I wanted to argue against in your interpretation of John. Quote, the Jews, his opponents that oppose him in the Gospel of John, I think are kind of stooges. Like, they're presented as these spiritually blind people, right? So one of them wonders, is being born again going back into your mother? At one point, they think he's advocating cannibalism because he says you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And then, they're jumping at everything he says, but they're misunderstanding everything he says. And so it's really a risky interpretive strategy to say, see, they understood. That's what the evangelicals do when they're arguing for the divinity of Christ based on the Gospel of John. But I see the Jews as kind of these foolish characters, basically.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could read it that way, but just this particular passage, Jesus is talking. When he says that Abraham saw my day and rejoiced, and the Jews replied, "You're not yet 50 years old. Have you seen Abraham?"
Right. That's the stupid.
Well, and then he says, before Abraham was, I am. So he's saying, yes, I did see Abraham. I was before him.
Well, he doesn't say he saw Abraham. He says, before Abraham was, I was destined to be the Messiah.
It's a response to the question, have you seen Abraham? And Jesus says, very truly, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am.
He's happy to leave them in their foolishness, but then, right, just like he lets people walk away from him when they think that they're supposed to literally eat his flesh and drink his blood, right?
Well, I don't think that's the most natural way to read the passage. I mean, and then they pick up stones to stone him, and John never says, actually, he never committed blasphemy. He was just talking about something else. John knows that by normal Jewish criteria, Jesus has committed a blasphemy. But it's not a blasphemy because he really is who he says he is, which is that he's the pre-existent divine being who's become a human.
I mean, I used to read it exactly as you're describing. The thing that convinced me to change my understanding of the passage is the very tricky argument that Jesus gives toward the end. So again, he says, even beings other than God can be called God. So then he gives a kind of greater than argument. So his point is, it's a really forcefully put point. If these low-down people who aren't as great as me can be called God, which is a higher title, then it can't be blasphemous for me, who am greater than those guys, to be called by this lesser title, Son of God.
Yeah. Well,
so he pointedly, yeah. So he pointedly corrects them on what he's claiming and what he's not claiming.
In John, that's just him using a tricky argument to win an argument. I mean, the author, John, doesn't have any doubt about Jesus being a pre-existent divine being. I mean, not only is it clearly stated in the prologue, but also in John, in his prayer to God in John chapter 17, where he prays to God the Father, glorify me with the glory that I had with you in your presence before the world was created.
Well, that's another one that can be taken as predestination, as something that's predestined, eternally existing with God, right? So the lamb slain from the foundation of the world, I think Paul says somewhere.
Yeah,
but no, I'm not disputing that he thinks, I think you can argue against it. There are interpreters that have argued against even that John thinks that Jesus literally pre-exists, but I'm not disputing that, but just only the point that John can't be saying here that Jesus is God himself, or God in the absolute highest sense.
But he is God.
In a similar, in a lower sense.
I think the problem is you're a philosopher, and this doesn't work. John is not a philosopher.
Well, no, once you grant the coherence of the concept of a generic deity, there's nothing inconsistent about believing in many lower down deities and one monotheistic God.
Yeah, I think this is the point that I stress in my book, is that there are levels of divinity, whether you're a Roman, pagan, or a Greek, or if you're a Jew. There are levels of divinity. So Jews do think there's one creator God, yes, but there are other gods too. And in Christian circles, Jesus is God. It doesn't mean he's
right.
God the Father, but he is God.
Okay, yeah. We'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you online at trinities.org.